The torpedo stopped moving. It weighed over a ton. He was in pitch-black harbor water at 40 feet of depth in a rubber suit, breathing through a rebreather that recycled his own exhaled air. His crewmate had already been forced to the surface by an oxygen equipment failure. And the machine he had ridden 4 miles into this harbor had just sunk to the bottom. Luigi Durand de la Penne was 27 years old. He had been training for this moment for 2 years. He was the most experienced frogman in the Italian Navy. He had volunteered for 3 previous missions, all of which had failed or been aborted. This was supposed to be different. He grabbed the tow rope attached to the torpedo and started pulling. A 1,200-kilogram torpedo across harbor mud, in the dark, alone, at 40 feet of depth, with a British battleship directly above him, and the British crew on deck looking for exactly the kind of disturbance he was making. He pulled for 40 minutes. The Italian Navy's interest in attacking ships at anchor went back to the First World War. In November of 1918, 2 Italian naval officers rowed a torpedo into the harbor at Pola on the Adriatic coast and sank the Austrian dreadnought Viribus Unitis with a limpet mine. That attack had been the most successful naval commando operation in history at that point, and the Italian Navy had not forgotten it. The weapon they developed in the years between the wars was called the Siluro a lenta corsa, which translates as slow-running torpedo. The Navy gave it this name because the correct name mattered for the budget justification, but the men who rowed it called it the maiale, which means pig. It handled like one. The machine was steered from a saddle position by 2 men who sat astride it like a very slow and very cold underwater motorcycle, breathing recycled air from a rebreather system and trying to see in the dark with goggles that fogged. The warhead detached from the front of the torpedo and was designed to be clamped to the underside of a ship's hull. When the timer ran out, the ship sank. The theory was elegant. The physics were sound. The execution in practice was extremely difficult. The machine was about 6 meters long and weighed roughly 1,400 kilograms fully loaded. Electrically powered, it moved at about 2 to 3 knots, just fast enough to make progress against a harbor current. The pilot and crewmen wore rubber dry suits, oxygen rebreathers, and swim fins. The oxygen rebreather recycled exhaled air through soda lime to remove carbon dioxide, then supplemented it with oxygen from a high-pressure cylinder. At depth, this worked. At great depth, or for extended periods, it could produce oxygen toxicity, the same problem that had plagued the German Draeger apparatus. The operational depth limit was about 15 meters. Attacks on deep-anchored capital ships required care about how much time the frogmen spent at each depth level. The 2 officers most responsible for developing the maiale were Teseo Tesei and Elios Toshi. Both volunteered for operational missions. Teseo Tesei died in July 1941, attempting to attack the harbor entrance gate at Malta, the charges detonating prematurely before the gate could be opened. He knew the timer had started too early, and he stayed with his machine rather than abandoning it to keep it on target. He was posthumously awarded Italy's highest military honor. His name is on the wall of the training base, where his techniques are still taught. The unit that operated the maiale was the 10th Flottiglia Mass, Italy's 10th assault flotilla, formally organized in March of 1941. It was, by the standard of any military anywhere in the war, an extraordinary organization. The men were selected for swimming ability, physical conditioning, and a specific psychological profile that was described in the selection documentation as a combination of technical competence and complete disregard for personal safety. Every single man who was available to volunteer for the Alexandria mission did so. On December 3rd, 1941, the Italian submarine Sire left the naval base at La Spezia on what its official documentation described as an ordinary training cruise. The documentation was false. On board were 3 canisters attached to the submarine's outer hull, each containing a maiale. Borghese had made the same deception before. He had taken Sire to Gibraltar 4 times between September 1940 and September 1941, conducting or attempting to conduct attacks on British shipping there. The first Gibraltar mission found the harbour empty and was aborted. The second and third failed. The fourth, in September of 1941, put 3 British merchant ships out of action. Borghese had been promoted and placed in command of all underwater operations for 10th MAS on the strength of that result. The Alexandria mission, Operation EA3, was the 3rd Italian attempt on that particular harbour. The two previous attempts had both failed. This one was different because the intelligence was better, the planning was more thorough, and the men going in were now experienced rather than experimental. On December 9th, as Sire was transiting south of Crete, a Royal Air Force aircraft from the 201st Group spotted the submarine on the surface. The aircraft challenged the submarine with a recognition signal. Borghese's crew responded with that day's correct signal and waved from the deck. The pilot's report noted that the submarine appeared to be German and had answered the challenge correctly. It was logged and forgotten. Sire reached the island of Leros in the Aegean on December 9th. The 6 frogmen flew in by aircraft and joined the submarine. On December 18th, having received confirmation that the 2 British battleships were in harbour, Borghese manoeuvred into position in the dark water off Alexandria. At 240 metres from the harbour entrance and 15 metres of depth, he released the 3 maiali. The 6 men on them were already in the water. At 1 in the morning on December 19th, 3 British destroyers approached the harbour entrance at Alexandria, returning from operations in the Sirte Gulf. The harbour boom opened to let them through. 3 Italian frogmen waited in the water and slipped through behind them. The harbour was not passive. British patrol craft were running and dropping small explosive charges to deter exactly what was happening. The explosions in the water around the frogmen were disorienting and physically painful. They were designed to be. Concussion in water travels efficiently through flesh, and the detonations going off near the maiali teams were not harmless discomforts. The 3 teams separated toward their targets. Maiale 222, commanded by Captain Vincenzo Martellotta, with Sergeant Major Mario Marino as his crewman, was assigned to attack a British aircraft carrier. When Martellotta reached the position where the carrier had been anchored, it wasn't there. The carrier had moved. Martellotta and Marino had to find an alternative target. They located the oil tanker Sagona, with the British destroyer Jervis moored alongside it, taking on fuel. They placed their warhead charge beneath the Sagona's hull, set the timer, and then made for the harbour's edge to get out. They were arrested by a harbour police patrol as they tried to leave. Maiale 223, commanded by Captain Antonio Marsiglia with Lance Corporal Spartaco Shergat, had the smoothest operation of the 3. They reached the battleship Queen Elizabeth, placed their warhead charge beneath the hull, set the timer, and successfully evaded the harbour patrols. They got out of the harbour, got into Alexandria itself, and were moving through the city when they were captured the following day by Egyptian police who contacted the British authorities. Maiale 221, commanded by Lieutenant Luigi Durand de la Penne with Sergeant Major Emilio Bianchi, had the worst night. The engine on Maiale 221 stopped somewhere in the harbour, with the battleship Valiant still ahead of them in the dark, and the torpedoes sank to the floor. Bianchi, simultaneously, developed a failure in his oxygen rebreather and had to surface to avoid losing consciousness. De la Penne was now alone in the water, without his crewman, with a non-functional torpedo on the harbour floor. He could have surfaced. That was the rational choice. The machine was broken, his crewmate was gone, the mission appeared over. The harbour patrols were running. The explosions from the patrol craft's depth charges were continuing. The water temperature at 40 feet in December was cold enough that extended time in it, at this depth, in this level of exertion, was a real medical risk. He grabbed the tow rope and pulled. Imagine what that 40 minutes felt like. You are alone at 40 feet of depth, in a strange harbour. You cannot see anything, and you cannot hear except for the sounds of water and occasional explosions. You are pulling a 1,200-kilogram machine across the harbour floor by a rope toward a target you can see only as a dark shape interrupting the lighter darkness above you. Every pull is 30 seconds. Every 30 seconds, the machine moves a few meters. If someone above you in the ship drops a line or casts a light downward, you are captured. If the patrol craft pass overhead with charges running, the explosions will hit you full in the body. If your oxygen rebreather fails, you have approximately 3 minutes. It is 40 minutes of that, not seconds, not a dramatic moment. 40 minutes of pulling at the harbour floor in cold, dark water, alone, with no certainty that your crewman is alive, with no certainty that your torpedo will explode when the timer runs out, with no certainty that the position you eventually reach is the right position to do the damage you came to do. De La Pen later described the experience in an account published after the war. He wrote that his thoughts during the effort were almost entirely mechanical. He was calculating drag, adjusting direction, managing his breathing rate to conserve oxygen. The human experience of the situation, the fear and the exhaustion and the loneliness, he put into a different compartment of his mind and dealt with later. When De La Pen surfaced, he had been in the water for somewhere between 3 and 4 hours, counting the approach from the submarine. He had completed the task he came to complete. He had set the timer on a charge that was resting on the harbour floor rather than clamped to the hull, and he had positioned it as well as he could and hoped. He got the torpedo to the Valiant. He manoeuvred it into position under the hull, approximately amidships. He wasn't certain whether this position would produce the result he needed. He set the timer anyway. When he surfaced, a sentry caught him in a spotlight and fired a warning burst into the water. De La Pena and Bianchi, who had been floating quietly at the surface nearby, were captured within minutes. They were brought aboard the Valiant. Captain Charles Morgan commanded the Valiant. He interrogated De La Pen and Bianchi about what they had done in his harbour. Both men said nothing. Morgan had them confined in a cabin on the ship's lowest deck, below the waterline. The decision to confine prisoners in the lowest deck of a ship they may have mined was Morgan's attempt at psychological pressure. If De La Pen knew his own charges were going to kill him, perhaps he would speak. The problem with this logic was that De La Pen did not speak. He sat in the forward hold of the Valiant for 2 hours and 50 minutes, with the timer he had set running down. Then, with approximately 10 minutes before detonation, he sent word to Captain Morgan that an explosion was imminent and that Morgan should evacuate the lower decks. He refused to say where the charge was. He refused to say what had been placed under the ship. He gave Morgan enough information to save his crew and nothing more. Morgan evacuated the lower decks. He sent De La Pen and Bianchi back to the confined forward hold, now informed that the explosion was coming, still in the compartment closest to the charge. At approximately 6 in the morning, the mine exploded. The seabed charge had been on the harbour bottom below the Valiant, rather than slung from the keel, and the effect was different from what the planned configuration would have produced. Valiant settled slowly onto the harbour floor. Her keel rested on the harbour floor. Her deck remained above the waterline. 8 men were killed aboard the Queen Elizabeth when Marselia and Shergat's charge detonated at almost the same moment. The tanker Sagona lost her stern section when Martelotta's charge went off. The destroyer Jervis, moored alongside the Sagona for refueling, was damaged. De La Pen and Bianchi reached the deck of Valiant in time to watch the other explosions. All 6 Italian frogmen were now prisoners. Both battleships appeared, from the surface and from the air, to be operational. They were sitting on the harbour floor, but their decks were above the waterline, and they were not obviously sunk. The British flags still flew. Admiral Andrew Cunningham was the Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet. He understood within hours what had happened. His fleet's 2 battleships were on the harbour floor, functionally out of action for an indeterminate period. He had no other capital ships available in the Mediterranean. The Italian Navy, which had been fighting a war it was mostly losing, had just achieved tactical parity in the eastern Mediterranean with 6 men in rubber suits. Cunningham ordered a complete news blackout. He continued to use the Queen Elizabeth as his flagship. He went aboard the damaged battleship every morning at the regular time in his regular uniform. He held meetings aboard. He presented the appearance to anyone watching from shore or from the air of a commander who was operating normally from a functioning fleet. He told the crews of both ships to maintain normal appearance and activity. He ordered that no repair work be visible from outside the ships. The battleships were being made watertight from within, with cofferdams and pumping as invisibly as possible. Dock workers who came aboard for the work were briefed on secrecy. The officers coordinating the repairs passed communications through channels designed to avoid standard administrative records. Midshipman Frank Wade was serving aboard the Queen Elizabeth when the attack happened. He later described what the crew had been told before it. A general warning had come from the Admiralty on the afternoon of December 18th. The crew was mustered and told to watch for anything unusual in the water. Wade remembered that the response from the mess deck was, in his own words, one of unconcern. Warnings about Italian frogmen had come before. Nothing had happened. The precautions felt routine. The boom was closed. The explosive charges were being dropped. From every visible indicator, the defences were functioning. None of it mattered when 3 Maiali slipped through the boom opening behind returning destroyers at 1 in the morning. The Italian High Command had no confirmation of their success for 3 weeks. The 6 frogmen were prisoners and couldn't report. German reconnaissance aircraft flew over Alexandria and reported the ships as apparently undamaged. The Italian Navy relied on delayed signals intelligence and second-hand reports. On January 8, 1942, they issued a bulletin suggesting the attack had likely succeeded. On January 9th, they confirmed that both battleships had been heavily damaged. By that point, 3 weeks had passed since the attack. The strategic window in which Italy might have exploited its temporary Mediterranean superiority had partly closed. Borghese, according to his memoir, was furious that the Italian High Command had not taken immediate advantage of the opportunity the Decima Mass had created. Churchill told a secret session of the House of Commons in April of 1942 about the attack. He described what Cunningham had done with a single sentence. Both ships were sunk on an even keel. They looked all right from the air. The enemy were for some time unaware of the success of their attack. Valiant was towed to the Admiralty Floating Dock No. 5 on December 21, 1941, 2 days after the attack. She underwent temporary repairs at Alexandria until April of 1942 and then sailed to Durban, South Africa for more permanent work. She was out of active service until July of 1942, 7 months. Queen Elizabeth had been the more severely damaged of the two. She was out of service for 18 months. She didn't return to operational duty until June of 1943, well over a year after she had settled onto the Alexandria harbour floor. The oil tanker Sagona, which Martellotta and Marino had targeted as their secondary target, when the aircraft carrier wasn't there, was considered a total loss and spent the rest of the war as a stationary barracks ship. The destroyer Jervis, which had been moored alongside the Sagona when the charge detonated, required 6 weeks of repairs. 6 men, 3 Maiali, 1 night, 2 battleships, a tanker, and a destroyer. In the published history of naval special operations, the raid on Alexandria is cited as the most successful attack by yield ratio in the history of underwater warfare. The 6 frogmen were carrying roughly 2,400 kilograms of explosive between them. They damaged or sank vessels totaling well over 50,000 tons of displacement. The Italian Navy had been outweighed in the Mediterranean by the Royal Navy by virtually every conventional measure. For approximately 18 months after December 19, 1941, the Eastern Mediterranean was essentially undefended by Allied capital ships. Malta could have been taken. Rommel's supply lines could have been secured. The Axis position in North Africa, which at that point was still far from settled, might have been consolidated in a way that affected the entire subsequent course of the war in that theatre. Whether the German command's unwillingness to commit forces to the Malta invasion was the decisive factor in Italy's failure to exploit the window is a debate among historians that hasn't fully resolved. What is not in dispute is that 6 men in rubber suits came closer to changing the strategic course of the Mediterranean War than any other operation of comparable size in the entire conflict. All 6 frogmen were captured, but the way they were captured tells the story of the operation's planning and the men's training as well as anything else. Della Pen and Bianchi were captured in the harbour itself, within minutes of placing their charge, because surfacing had been unavoidable. They had placed their mine successfully. They were prisoners of the ship they had just mined. Martellotta and Marino were arrested by the harbour police as they tried to leave the harbour perimeter on foot after placing their charge under the Sagona. The plan had called for any frogman who wasn't immediately captured to make for a rendezvous point where the submarine Zafiro had been dispatched to wait for survivors. Martellotta and Marino were within reach of that possibility when the harbour police stopped them. They had completed their mission successfully and nearly escaped. Marsiglia and Shergat had the best chance of any of the 6. They placed their charge under the Queen Elizabeth without difficulty, evaded the harbour patrols, got out of the naval base, and got into Alexandria itself. They were moving through the city with a reasonable plan for reaching the coast and the rendezvous submarine when Egyptian police recognized something unusual about their appearance and detained them. The British authorities were notified. They were handed over. The detail that Marsiglia and Shergat got as far as they did into Alexandria before being caught is worth noting. It means that a successfully executed mission, with good timing and some luck, would have produced at least 2 survivors. The plan was not suicidal. It was extremely dangerous, but it had an escape route. The men who volunteered for it knew there was a chance of coming home. 4 years after the operation, when de la Penne went back to fighting in the same waters, he was fighting alongside the men who had captured him. The raid on Alexandria was the third attempt on that harbour. The 2 previous operations against Alexandria had both failed completely. Looking at them tells you something about the learning curve that produced December 19th, 1941. The first attempt, Operation EA-1 in August of 1940, ended before it started. The transport submarine Iraid, carrying the Maiali and their crews to the launch position, was spotted on the surface by a British swordfish torpedo bomber near the Gulf of Bomba and sunk in shallow water. De la Penne was among the frogmen who went in to rescue survivors from the sunken submarine. He dove repeatedly into the Iraid. Of 12 survivors who could be extracted, 9 were pulled alive, though 2 died of wounds shortly after. One crew member refused to come out of the flooded submarine and died there. The second attempt, Operation EA-2, in May of 1941, launched 3 Maiali from outside Alexandria harbour. All 3 suffered mechanical failures before reaching their targets. The frogmen surfaced, were spotted, and were captured without the operation achieving anything. The pattern from both failures was the same. The machines were the weakest link. The men were capable. The planning was sound. But the technology was not yet reliable enough to sustain a complex operation with multiple machines all needed to function simultaneously. Between May 1941 and December of the same year, the Decima Mas improved the Maiali. They refined the oxygen rebreather design. They improved the engine seals. They trained with the modified machines extensively, specifically working on the problems that had caused failures in the earlier operations. By the time Operation EA-3 launched, every man had extensive practice with the improved equipment. They had also practiced the specific maneuver that de la Penne ended up needing, pushing a non-functional Mayal across the floor. It was in the training. It had been added to the program after the May failure, as a contingency drill for an engine that stopped at depth. He didn't improvise that 40-minute effort in the dark. He had trained for it. That is, what the 2 years of preparation and 3 failed operations had produced. Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham was one of the Royal Navy's most effective commanders. He had been fighting the Mediterranean War since Italy entered it in June of 1940, and he had developed an accurate sense of what the Italian Navy was and wasn't capable of. He knew about the earlier attempts on Alexandria. He had received warnings from the Admiralty. On the afternoon of December 18th, the day before the attack, the Admiralty sent Cunningham a general warning that an operation against Alexandria might be imminent. The warning was based on intelligence about a German reconnaissance flight over the harbour, which British code breakers had deciphered from a German signal. The warning was not specific. It didn't identify when or exactly how. Midshipman Frank Wade, serving aboard the Queen Elizabeth, later described what happened when the warning was passed to the ship's crew. The crew was mustered on the quarterdeck and told to watch out for anything suspicious. Wade recalled that the response in the mess deck was, to use his own description, one of unconcern. The crew had been warned about Italian frogmen before, and nothing had come of it. The warnings had the quality of routine precaution rather than specific threat. The harbour patrols were running, the anti-swimmer charges were being dropped. The boom was closed except when ships needed to pass. From every visible indicator, the defences were functioning. None of that mattered when 3 Maiali slipped through the boom in the wake of returning destroyers at 1 in the morning. The deception that Cunningham imposed after the attack was a masterwork of operational security. The entire Mediterranean fleet knew their flagship had a hole in her bottom and was sitting on the harbour floor. The shore establishments and the dock workers and the port officials knew that 2 major warships had been damaged. Cunningham maintained the appearance of normality under the eyes of all of them. He sat in his flag cabin on a ship that was resting on the seabed. He held meetings and issued orders. He insisted that the repairs proceed invisibly and that no sign of distress be visible from the surface. It worked for 3 weeks, long enough to keep the enemy uncertain about exactly what had been accomplished, and long enough to prevent any immediate exploitation of the strategic window the attack had opened. The Decima MAS operated at the extreme edge of what a small specialized unit could accomplish. Their strategic impact depended entirely on the larger Italian military and naval command being ready to exploit what they created. Junior Valerio Borghese took the Sire back to La Spezia after dropping the frogmen at Alexandria. He didn't know the result of the operation for weeks. When he finally learned what his 6 men had done, and then learned what the Italian command had done with the opportunity, he wrote in his memoir, Sea Devils, that he found the outcome incomprehensible. The Italian Navy had briefly achieved something it had been fighting for since 1940, naval superiority in the Eastern Mediterranean. With both British battleships out of action, Italian surface forces could have operated in the Eastern Mediterranean with a freedom that had been denied to them for the entire war. Rommel's North African supply line across the Mediterranean, which was routinely being cut by Allied naval forces, could have been secured for the months it took to repair the British ships. Malta, which the Axis powers had been trying to neutralize for a year, was at its most vulnerable without a functioning British battle fleet to threaten any invasion convoy. The Italians were ready to move against Malta. The Germans were not. The decision-making that followed the Alexandria raid involved the same coordination problems that had hampered Axis strategy in the Mediterranean throughout the war. Rommel needed his supplies, and Malta was the block on them. The Italian Navy could now operate against Malta more freely than at any point since the war began, and the German High Command judged the risk of a Malta invasion too high. The window closed. 3 weeks after 6, Italian frogmen had handed their country a strategic opportunity that might have changed the course of the North African campaign. The opportunity had passed largely unexploited. Borghese didn't conceal his frustration in his memoir. The Decima Emas had done its part. After the Italian armistice in September 1943, De La Penne accepted the offer of release from prisoner of war status to fight for the Allies. He went back to being a frogman. In June 1944, he participated in a joint Italian-British underwater operation in La Spezia harbour, then in German hands. A team of British and Italian divers attacked the harbour from a destroyer. They sank the Italian cruisers Gorizia and Bolzano before the Germans could use them to block the harbour entrance. De La Penne had first tried to sink ships in that harbour in 1940. He finished the war-sinking ships for the other side in the same harbour 4 years later. The British techniques for harbour defence that developed after Alexandria were substantially influenced by what the Italian frogmen had demonstrated. Every major naval base re-examined its boom defences, its patrol patterns, its explosive charge protocols, and its methods for detecting swimmers in the water. The British Frogmen programme, which eventually became the Special Boat Service, drew directly on what Decima MAS had shown. The training doctrines, the breathing apparatus designs, the methods for attaching mines to hulls underwater. Many were derived from the Italian programme or developed in direct response to it. What happened to the other men from the Alexandria operation is worth tracing. Marseglia and Shergat were exchanged as prisoners after the armistice and returned to Italy. Marseglia went back to the Italian Navy and spent the rest of the war in an administrative role. He died in 1963. Shergat outlived him considerably and was still alive in the 1990s when Italian historians were conducting interviews about the operation. Martellotta and Marino, the crew who had been arrested trying to leave the harbour perimeter, also returned to Italy after the armistice. Marino later wrote about the operation in the 1980s as part of the broader project of documenting Decima Mas history. Emilio Bianchi, De La Penne's crewman, who had been forced to the surface by his equipment failure, was also released and returned to Italy. He had spent the years of captivity knowing that the torpedo he had ridden into the harbour had worked, that his commander had completed the operation alone, and that the decision to surface rather than stay with the machine had been the right one given his equipment failure, and yet had also left his partner to face the worst hours of the mission without backup. All 6 men were awarded the Gold Medal of Military Valor by the Italian government. It is Italy's highest military decoration. All 6 received it for the same operation, performed in the same harbour, on the same night. Vittorio Borghese, who had commanded the Sire and delivered the frogmen to their launch point, continued leading Decima MAS special operations for the rest of the war. His post-war history is complicated. He was arrested in 1945 on charges of collaboration with the German occupation forces after the Italian armistice. He was tried and convicted. He was eventually released as part of a broader amnesty program. He became involved in post-war Italian politics, of a kind that his admirers and critics have argued about ever since. He died in Cadiz, Spain, in August of 1974, in circumstances that the official record describes as natural causes, And that, Spanish and Italian, journalists were still investigating decades later. The submarine Sire herself was lost in August of 1942, 8 months after the Alexandria raid, torpedoed and sunk by the British submarine Triton off Haifa during an operation to deliver frogmen for an attack on that harbour. All of her crew were killed. The United States Navy began developing its own underwater demolition teams in 1943. The training framework drew on British experience with Italian techniques. The modern Navy SEALs trace their institutional lineage through those teams. That lineage runs back through several generations of translation and adaptation to the Decima mass and to the 2 men who first rode a torpedo across a harbour floor in 1918. After the raid on Alexandria, every navy in the world accepted that a ship at anchor was not safe. Every major port in every theatre of the war changed its underwater defences in the following months. Booms were redesigned and patrol patterns were changed. The explosive charges dropped by harbour patrols to deter swimmers became standard procedure at every major naval base. Lookouts were trained to watch the water as well as the sky. The assumption that a defended harbour was a safe harbour turned out to be an assumption that 6 men in rubber suits had permanently ended. The Decima MAS techniques became the template for naval special operations that all the major powers developed for the rest of the war. The British chariots were direct copies of the Mayal. The American underwater demolition teams carried the methodology across the Pacific. Every modern combat diver, from the Navy SEALs to the British Special Boat Service to equivalent units across the world, uses procedures and equipment that trace their lineage to what de la Penne and his 5 companions carried into Alexandria Harbour on the night of December 18th, 1941. In May of 1945, Admiral Charles Morgan travelled to Taranto and pinned Italy's gold medal for military valour on Luigi Durand de la Penne. Morgan had been the captain of the Valiant. He had been the man de la Penne refused to answer in the interrogation. He had sent de la Penne back to the compartment directly above the mine after being warned an explosion was coming, and waited to see what happened. He wrote afterward, "I had the pleasure and honour of decorating de la Penne with the highest award granted by the Italian Navy for the very courageous and gallant attack he made on my ship 3 years and 3 months ago." Think about what that ceremony required from both men. Morgan had nearly been killed by the man he was now decorating. De la Penne had warned Morgan in time to save his crew, then gone back to a compartment above a mine. Morgan had placed him there, knowing what the situation was. 3 years and 3 months later, they stood together in Taranto, and Morgan pinned the medal on the man who had done it, and called it a pleasure and an honour. De la Penne lived until 1992. He died in Genoa, where he had been born, at the age of 77. The Italian Navy named a class of destroyers after him in 1993. The lead ship bearing his name is still in service. The harbour at Alexandria is a commercial port today. Ships anchor in the same water where Valiant and Queen Elizabeth settled onto the seabed on the morning of December 19th, 1941. There is nothing visible to mark what happened there. The defences that every navy redesigned after that morning are still the basis of how ports are protected today. The 6 men in rubber suits made that necessary. They did it in one night, with equipment that weighed less than the charge de la Penne pushed across the harbour floor alone in the dark. And there is one more detail worth keeping. De la Penne gave Morgan the warning with 10 minutes to spare, not 10 seconds, not after the explosion had already started. 10 minutes in which Morgan had time to act, and in which Morgan made the decision to evacuate the lower decks, but send de la Penne and Bianchi back to the compartment directly above the mine. Morgan had confined them there as a pressure tactic. When de la Penne warned him, Morgan responded by sending him back. That is a decision that requires its own examination. Morgan was a naval officer under attack in his own harbour. He had 2 prisoners who had mined his ship. He had received a warning, but no information he could use to disarm or move away from the charge. Sending the men who had placed it back to the location above it was both a continuation of the pressure tactic and, in some sense, a military judgment about who should bear the risk of what they had done. De la Penne bore it. The explosion came, and Valiant shuddered around him. He reached the deck in time to see the other charges go off. 3 years and 3 months later, Morgan pinned the medal on him. What de la Penne thought about that, sitting in the forward hold of the Valiant in the final minutes before the explosion, is not recorded. He wrote about the operation in technical detail afterward. He described the approach, the equipment failure, the the 40 minutes pushing the torpedo, the surrender, the interrogation, and the confinement. He described telling Morgan the explosion was coming. He did not, in any surviving account, describe what he thought about in the 10 minutes between the warning and the detonation. Some things a man keeps. Whatever de la Penne thought in those 10 minutes, the mine detonated, the water came in, and the ship settled. He had done what he came to do, and he had done it alone in the dark.